Good evening. This is Bible Answers. My name is Evan Gregory, and as always, this is brought to you by the North website. Scrolling below me is northcolumbus.christian.com. Tonight, we're going to be looking at Nicodemus and some lessons that we can learn from Nicodemus. He's a character that's mentioned in John chapter 3. And so he goes and meets Jesus, and Jesus has a conversation with him. And we actually see him in other chapters in the book of John. And so, again, we're just going to see what we can learn from him, and all of our verses, as always, is on the screen here. And so we see that this guy by the name of Nicodemus, he's only mentioned by name in the book of John. In John chapter 3 and verse 1, he's described as a Pharisee, a ruler of the Jews. And so this would have been a learned man. He would have been intelligent. He would know what the law taught. So this wasn't just some guy off the street that's coming to talk to Jesus. And so, uh, in the context there, John chapter 3, and you see verse 1 on the screen there, we do see where Jesus is in Jerusalem. John starts off later in Jesus' life than we might see in earlier Gospels. And so this is already, kind of towards the end of Jesus' life. And here at the end of John chapter 2, we see that he was in Jerusalem. But notice what it also says. It says, now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs which he did. And so Jesus was performing signs. People were believing that when they saw the signs, and they were believing not just in the signs, but it says they believed in his name. They believed in who he was claiming to be. We see in multiple passages, for example, in Hebrews chapter 1, and we talked about this several times on the show here in past episodes, that the point of these miracles were not just to make people's lives easier. He wasn't feeding people just to, so they won't be hungry. He was performing these miracles so that they would believe in what he was saying, that they would believe that he was the Messiah, and that God was using those miracles to verify who he was. And so they would see these signs, and it says they believed in his name. This idea of his name is like they're believing in his authority. You think about if a cop says stop in the name of the law, they have that authority to say that they are an authority figure there. And if you're doing something in someone's name, you're doing it with that authority that's been given to you by them. And so, this idea of believing in his name, they were believing who he was, they were believing in his power, his authority as well. So, John 3 and verse 1, it says, there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. Now, again, at at the beginning here and throughout, I believe it's all of chapter 3, or at least most of chapter 3. Nicodemus asks some questions. Jesus responds, and so uh, we see here that Nicodemus came to Jesus by night, and he makes that same statement, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. Notice that he came by night. Now, it's not explicitly said why that he came by night. We'll see later on, not to get too ahead of ourselves, that John clarifies who Nicodemus is, and so John will mention Nicodemus later in other chapters in his book, and he makes mention that this Nicodemus was the one that came by night. That he makes the point and clarifies that this is that same Nicodemus that we see in John chapter 3. Again, we're not sure exactly why, but I think there's a point. I think there's a point why John keeps mentioning that He was that one who came by night. If you read throughout the book of John, we do see where the Jews and really the leaders of the Jews wanted to kill Jesus. They wanted him off of the stage, and they actually said basically anybody that's following them with him was going to be punished. We see in John chapter 7 and verse 13 says, "However, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews." They were if somebody was going to be talking saying, "Hey, that they believe Jesus," they were scared of what the Jews might do to him. John 9, verse 22 says, "His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue." Again, anyone confess Christ, they would be put out. And so they were scared of making any statements that would look like they are confessing Christ. And in John 12, verse 42 through 43 says, "Nevertheless, even among the rulers, many believed in him, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God." And so we see many examples of people just scared. It's not that they did not believe. It says that they believed in him, but they were scared to confess him. They were scared to say anything about him. They were scared to say that they believed in him. So I think that Nicodemus coming by night, this is part of that same attitude here. That he's coming at night so nobody can see him. And it seems as though he's trying to be sneaky in coming to Jesus and talk to him. So we see, again, I think, and I'm pretty confident that this is that attitude surrounding him, that he believes, or at least he's talking like he believes, but yet he's just not 100% ready to come out in full force, out in the daylight, confessing him before men. We see where Nicodemus calls him rabbi. This would have mean in their language teacher or master. So this is he gives him some title of authority there, that he's seen as a teacher or a master. He says that we know some things about you. And we don't know what the we is. You think about, is he talking about other Pharisees, other leaders? Something that we might have seen, like what we just read in John chapter 3, or there's some other Jews that believe him, and that would have been the case. That there would have been other Jews that would have believed him. So we really don't know. But there are others that know some things about Jesus. And it says, "A teacher, we know you are a teacher come from God, and that he cannot do these things. He could not perform these miracles unless God is with him." So we notice that statement there. And what Nicodemus is doing is he is making a true statement. He's looking at these miracles. He's looking at these signs and wonders. And he makes a conclusion that God has to be with him. He may not understand exactly the totality of who Jesus is, but notice that statement that we know that you're from God. We know that you're a teacher come from God. No one can do these things unless God is with him. And so the miracles do have the proper effect that Nicodemus is putting two and two together, and he's recognizing that. And so moving on, we see, and so one thing about Nicodemus with making that statement is you do see that he's not just acting out an emotion. He's not hearing Jesus talk and just immediately revolting against him. We do see where he's using his brain to put two and two together, and he's making this conclusion based on the things in which he has seen. In John chapter 7, verse 45 through 52, it says, "Then the officers came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, 'Why have you not brought him?' The officers answered, 'No man ever spoke like this man.' Then the Pharisees answered them, 'Are you also deceived? Have any of the rulers or the Pharisees believed in him?' But this crowd that does not know the law is accursed. Nicodemus, he who came to Jesus by night, being one of them, said to them, "Does our law judge a man before it hears him and knows what he's doing?" They answered and said to him, "Are you also from Galilee? Search and look, for no prophet has arisen out of Galilee." I want to pay attention to that last part of that section there. And we see what Nicodemus is saying. These Pharisees, they want this, they want Jesus. They're saying, what, why have you not gotten him? And of course, their response, well, no man ever spoke like this man. I mean, he's something else. Jesus is something else. We just not haven't seen anything like him. But we see Nicodemus. What is he doing? He's being reasonable yet again. That he's pointing to the law. He's not pointing to emotion and what he thinks ought to be done. Notice what he says is, "Does our law judge a man before it hears him and knows what he is doing?" Uh, Again, we've seen earlier that Nicodemus has already made some conclusions on who Jesus was, that he was somebody that's from God, but yet again he's appealing to the law. He's not appealing to emotion. That the law was the standard on which one should be judged, and we see how to basically say there's no way. I mean, are you with him? Are you a follower or a prophet? For no prophet has arisen out of Galilee. So we see these instances where Nicodemus is not a rash, just a person that's driven or that has a tendency to just lash out. We do see where he seems to be a reasonable individual. Notice in Acts chapter 17 and verse 11, it says, "These were more fair minded than those in Thessalonica, and that they received the word with all readiness and searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so." These were Jews, followers of the old covenant, that were given the gospel, and a lot of times these Jews, if the gospel was spoken to them, they would immediately reject it. But notice what those in Berea would do. They didn't reject it, they didn't accept it either, but it says that they received the word. Okay, and this is not to the point where they believed it or not, They just received it, and then they checked it. They searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so, and they used the scriptures to verify the things in which the apostles were saying. They weren't going out with their pitchforks and torches immediately after Paul or any of the apostles said a word. They checked the scriptures, and and we see that these people are described as more fair-minded. That this is something to ascribe to. This is how we should be. That we need to check this word, not just immediately reject it, but look at the evidence and make a conclusion based on the evidence. We also see Gamaliel in Acts chapter 5, and he's not someone who's for the apostles. This would have again been one of the leaders of the Jews, and but he makes a statement that basically is saying, if these men, if the apostles are not being led by God, this is what they're doing is going to come to nothing. But if they are uh, being led by God, then we better not fight against them. We're going to be fighting up against God, and he makes that statement. And that statement again, I don't think he's a believer by no means, but what he is saying is something that is based in reason. That if God has given them this word, and God has given them uh, this job, this role that they are to be out teaching and spreading the gospel, you're not going to be able to stop it. And so we can just let it play its course, and we'll see what happens. And so we see these instances of these people, whether they're believers or not, that are acting in a reasonable and logical manner, and they're seen as people that are that should be held in high regard. And so we see these instances of Nicodemus and conclusions that he has made. In Joshua 22 and verse 33, long story short, in this context here, Gad, Reuben, and the half tribe of Manasseh, they're on the east side of the Jordan. The other tribes are on the west side. So the other tribes are technically in the promised land. And these three or two and a half tribes, rather, they're on the other side. They set up an altar not to worship or to offer sacrifices, but basically as a memorial or a sign to their children and to those on in the true promised land. I say the true, but the west side of over the Jordan, the land of what we would know as Israel, that basically not a part of Israel. And so when this altar being set up, they were thinking uh, that Reuben, Gad, and this half tribe, they were going to be rebelling against God and what God has said was proper worship. Phineas and those in Israel, they see this happening. They immediately go out as to fight against these tribes because they thought they were doing something which they were not, that they were going to sin, that they were rebelling against God. But they have this conversation in which these tribes, these two and a half tribes, basically say, "Hey, we just put this altar up basically as a memorial, not for any type of sacrifices or anything of that nature." And so that takes us to Joshua 22 and verse 30. It says, "Now when Phinehas the priest and rulers of the congregation, the heads of the divisions of Israel who were with him, heard the words that the children of Reuben, the children of Gad, and the children of Manasseh spoke, it pleased them." So they were ready to go out to war. They heard these other tribes explain what they were doing. And when Phineas, the priest, and these rulers in Israel, they heard it, said that it pleased them, that they were ready to fight, but they heard these people out, and they were pleased, and they didn't go and fight. And so we see these instances where people, they listen. They look at the evidence. They listen to what people have to say, and then make a conclusion on that, and not immediately just jump to some wrong conclusion, or like what could very easily happen here, that they just went out and fight these tribes and didn't listen to what they were going to say. Uh, and so we see that this type of mindset is praiseworthy. That we need to be willing to do the right thing, but listen, look at the evidence, use reason, use logic in coming up with your conclusions. In John 19, verse 38 through 40, we see another instance of Nicodemus. This is after Christ's death. It says, "After this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took the body of Jesus, and Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds. Then they took the body of Jesus and bound it in strips of linen with the spices, as the custom of the Jews is to bury. We see Joseph of Arimathea here. He was a disciple secretly, but it says that he went and basically took away the body of Jesus. And we also see Nicodemus here again. And again, he's described as the one who came to Jesus by night. That he comes along as well. We don't know the attitude of Nicodemus. I would think that he's probably has the same attitude of Joseph of Arimathea here. That they're still, they're they're kind of doing these things secretly, maybe not completely out in the open, but uh, they are noteworthy. That they're not to the point where they ought to be, but they're doing things that are respectable and noteworthy. That they're coming and taking the body of Jesus, and they're doing this. Very easily, if someone sees them, they could take it as they're followers of Jesus, and treat them as such, and basically putting their lives in danger. And so that we see here that even though they do these things secretly, they are coming and basically preparing the body of Jesus. We see where they bound the body of Jesus as well, to bury. And so, just really interesting little snippets that we see in the book of John when Nicodemus said he keeps showing up. And, you know, one thing that we see with I think there with Nicodemus and also with Joseph of Arimathea, that again they're not open. We do see that some of their with Joseph here, we do see that the some of his dealings is because of the fear of the Jews. But notice what Matthew 10, verse 32 through 33 says. It says, "Therefore, whoever confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven." There's a lot of people we see with Joseph, and I would say Nicodemus as well. We also see the other passages like what we looked at before, that people would not confess Jesus openly because of fear of the Jews. And Jesus says, if you don't if you don't confess me before men, if you deny me before men, I'm going to deny you. But if whoever confesses me before men, him I will also confess before my Father who is in heaven. We can be secretive. If someone asks us if we're a follower of Jesus, I mean, what are you going to say? Are you going to confess him before men or not? And Jesus says very clearly what's going to happen if confess him before men and those that won't. And we see that there's really these different levels of belief that the people are said to believe, but it's not to the point where they're willing to give up everything, willing to sacrifice for Jesus. They would not confess him, they would not acknowledge him before men. And so it's not just enough to just acknowledge and believe a certain set of facts in my mind. I have to confess Christ. I have to follow Him, regardless of the consequences there. And we see these instances where these people, I think they're growing, and I don't just totally discount what they're doing, but they're not at the level that we see that we should be here in these passages in Matthew chapter 10. And what we do see with Nicodemus, and I think we see a little bit of growth with him, but also that we see him doing a little bit more and more. And I think we do see some change in him, from going secretly at night to Jesus, to defending him, not in just a very outgoing way, but he is defending Jesus and saying that he should be judged by the law. And then to where he's basically prepping the body of Jesus, which would signify that he's not down with he does not agree with what has happened, and that he's a follower of Jesus, and that he's a friend to Jesus. And so we see this change. And for us, if we are alive, if we're breathing, if we're not doing what is right, there's always time to change. Romans 12, verse 2 says, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." We don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed. That we change by the renewing of our mind. That we change our mindset from one of just following the world, our own lusts and desires, into one that is a follower of God, and that we're proving and seeking what is good and acceptable in that perfect will of God. In Acts chapter 6 and verse 7, it says, Then the word of God spread, and the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests were obedient to the faith. That you see where these Jews, these priests, and probably, I say probably, very likely, that many of these same priests probably rejected Jesus initially, but we see where a great many of them were obedient to the faith. Maybe some of them that were not open about their belief in Jesus, that they would not confess Him. But we see where a great many of them did eventually become obedient to the faith. So they go from rejecting Jesus to being obedient to the faith of Jesus, obedient to Jesus. In Acts chapter 15 and verse 5, it says, But some of the sect of the Pharisees who believed rose up. Now, in the context of Acts chapter 15, they were teaching things that were not true. Okay. But it is interesting that there was a sect of the Pharisees who believed that they were Christians and they were Pharisees, but they did believe. And so we do see not all of the Pharisees, not all of the Sadducees, not all of those people that we see reject Jesus. Not all of those just continued to reject Him. That there were some who changed and believed, and so if they can change, we can change as well. 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 28 through 29. This is talking about King Ahab of Israel, and he was a terrible king, a wicked king. God pronounces judgment upon him and his family, and we see where we don't have it here, but Ahab reacts very strongly to that judgment. It says here, and the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, See how Ahab has humbled himself before me. Because he has humbled himself before me, I will not bring the calamity in his days, and the days of his son I will bring the calamity on his house. That God recognizes, even though Ahab is just purely wicked, and after this, it seems as though that he has that he reverts back to his old wicked ways. But at this time, there was change, and God recognizes that. He says, Ahab has humbled himself before me. And so this judgment that he has pronounced is not going to happen to him, but he's going to be spared from this, but it's going to happen in the days of his son. And so God recognizes that anybody, he does not just completely cast off people. If people will repent and change, God's going to recognize that regardless of how wicked one may be, whether one has directly helped to crucify Jesus, for example. Well, that person can still change. God is still willing to forgive that person. If He's willing to forgive Ahab, He's willing to forgive anybody. Because, like I said, you read First Kings, Ahab was a bad, bad individual, and yet God recognizes his humility. In Matthew 8 and verse 10, again, we see where Jesus heard, He marveled and said to those who followed, Assuredly I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. That there are people that maybe in Israel, maybe outside of Israel, that God recognizes, or Jesus here recognizing the faith of these individuals, regardless of where they're from, whether they're in Israel, whether they're outside of Israel. And so, again, God does not ignore people. He does not, as long as they have faith, as long as they're repentant, God's going to be aware, God's going to acknowledge them, and God's going to be pleased with those individuals. We also see and we've already mentioned this before, growth. I think that we see Nicodemus again. Not at, I don't think he's at the point where he should be, but we do see where there's some growth. There is some maturing. There is some I think some growing faith in Nicodemus. Philippians 3, verse 12 through 14 says, "Not that I've already attained or am already perfected, but I press on that I may lay hold of that for which Christ Jesus has also laid hold of me. Brethren, I do not count myself to have apprehended, but one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to those things which are ahead. I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus." This is Paul writing. He says, "I haven't already attained, and I'm not already perfected," but he keeps going. He keeps moving forward. And we recognize that Christians, they're going to continue to sin. We see that in First John. But one is to keep moving forward. There's always room for growth. There's always room for change. There's always something that's going to be needed to change. But here we see, one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to those things which are ahead. Again, he's not letting the things in the past hold him back. We do see where Paul recognizes that he was wrong in his past life, and I think that uh, it's evident that that bothers him. But it did not hinder him from moving forward to doing what he is now called to do. And we see that here, that he's reaching forward to those things which are ahead. So there's always room for growth, and there's always opportunity for growth as well, even for people who are extremely sinful and extremely wicked. And so that's the end of the lesson here. I hope that it's has been useful for you. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them. We put these videos up on YouTube. Our YouTube page is North Columbus Church of Christ. You can find lots and lots of videos there, and comment, like, subscribe to our channel as well. And you can see you can see all of our previous videos. So hope this has been useful. We'll keep on, Lord willing, try to put out these videos, and we'll come back next week with another episode of Bible Answers. Thanks.